There were no headlines written about what happened in courtroom 3 that morning. No reporters in the gallery. No live stream. Just a room so ordinary, so worn down by time, it might have seemed invisible to anyone passing by. But that was the danger of places like Millstone District Court. They were built to be forgotten, and yet, that morning, something unforgettable happened. Marlon James stood behind the defendant's bench, hands cuffed, wrists aching. 17 years old, thin frame wrapped in a borrowed dress shirt, collar too tight. His face was still soft with youth, but his eyes carried the weight of someone already punished. His name had been called 5 times, and each time, his shoulders tensed just a little more. The charge? Theft out a watch. Expensive enough to make it a felony. Not expensive enough to make anyone care. No prints. No footy. Just the word of a store clerk and a standard 3-paragraph indictment that felt like it had been pre-written months ago. In this courtroom. The joke went, if you walked in wearing cuffs, you walked out with a sentence. No one laughed when they said, the front of the room stood Barry Knox, veteran officer, decorated, though no one remembered for what. His uniform was always pristine, badge dulled by age, but his stare hadn't softened in 2 decades. Barry didn't need to raise his voice to dominate a space. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just stood there, feet wide, arms crossed, eyes cold. And people fell in line. They always did. Once, a rookie journalist sat in the wrong section. He didn't say a word, just walked over, leaned slightly, and she left the room without needing to be told twice. This wasn't his courtroom by law, but everyone knew it was his by order. Marlon shifted slightly, head turning toward the gallery. That's all it took. Barry stepped forward, rested a firm hand on the chain between the cuffs, and applied just enough pressure to push Marlon back toward the bench. It wasn't brutal. It didn't need to be. It was control, expressed like punctuation. You don't move unless I say so. Marlon clenched his jaw, didn't speak, didn't blink, but the fury rose in his chest, and still, he held it down, because that's what survival required. The rest of the room held its breath. A woman shook her head and looked away. A young man gripped his phone, but didn't lift it. A couple in suits stared at the floor, pretending not to see. Then, the back door opened. Not with a bang. Not even a creak. Just the soft sound of something unfamiliar slipping into a place it didn't belong. She stepped in, black coat, steady-paced, no introduction. No hesitation. Zara Quinn. She was small in stature, but carried an energy that didn't match her size. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes sharp, and in her hands she held a navy folder thick with documents. She didn't speak, didn't look around. She simply moved forward, as if her steps had been mapped long before this day. No badge. No announcement. But something about her made people shift in their seats. Barry saw her. He turned, narrowed his eyes. Not recognition, just discomfort that a stranger had entered his domain without asking. He walked toward her, slow and direct. A man who was used to eyes dropping, space clearing, silence following him like a second shadow. But this time, none of that happened. Zara didn't flinch, didn't bow. She looked right at him, and in her eyes, something ancient stirred. A calm that wasn't passiveness, it was precision. She wasn't here to be loud. She was here to be final. "Who are you?" Barry asked. His voice wasn't raised, but it didn't need to be. She didn't answer. Instead, she placed the folder gently on the bench, slid a sealed document from inside, held it up. Not like evidence, not like a threat. Just the way one might hold truth. Barry's frown deepened. He moved to block her line of sight. Stepped into the space she occupied like a wall closing in. I said, "Who do you think you are?" He asked again, tone sharpening. Zara stepped around him. Not confrontational, just uninterested in playing by his rules. She faced the judge, raised the document again. And still, she said nothing. That silence rattled Barry more than any shout could have. His face flushed. His jaw twitched. In his world, silence wasn't peaceful. It was rebellion. And rebellion had to be stopped. He stepped forward again, raised his hand toward her shoulder. Whether to push, grab, or just mark her as subordinate, even he might not have known. But before he could touch her, a voice rang out from the back. "Officer Knox, step away from her." Everyone turned to a man in a gray suit stood near the entrance, holding a DOJ badge. Miles Trent. His voice was even, but the command beneath it shook the room more than a gavel ever had. "This courtroom is now under federal oversight," he said. "She's not alone. And you're not in charge." Barry froze. Zara didn't blink in that moment. The room remembered what justice could look like. Calm, precise, and utterly unwilling to ask permission. Barry Knox didn't need a robe to hold power. He never sat behind the bench, never issued rulings, but somehow when he looked at you, it was already over. Not because he had the law on his side, but because he knew how to make fear speak louder than any verdict. And this morning, Barry wasn't looking at Marlon James like a suspect. He was looking at him like something beneath that, like an irritant, a smudge on the surface of ordered. IT wasn't suspicion in his eyes, that IT was contempt. Pure, sharp, and final. The kind of look that had made generations of black boys lower their heads before they even got the chance to explain. The kind that didn't wait for evidence. It didn't need context. Barry had already drawn the conclusion and buried the hope. He saw Marlon not as a boy, but as a pattern of a familiar silhouette in a file point, one more ghost in a system that liked its cages full and its paperwork cleaned. To Barry, skin wasn't a color. It was a signal. And the signal was always problem that if things moved faster, if the paperwork stayed light, if the verdicts came easy, then the city stayed peaceful. That was his idea of justice. Speed over truth. That on the prosecution bench sat Gordon Price, slouched into his suit like it was a burden. His face sagged with indifference. His voice moved at the pace of a clock left unwound. He read the charges like they were items on a grocery list. No urgency, no detail, no care. Gordon didn't argue. He didn't need to. This courtroom had already chosen its rhythm. Accuse. Skim the file. Nod. Sentence. Justice here wasn't blind. It was bored. He referred to Marlon as the subject and the individual with known behavioral patterns in an academic environment. Translation? Marlon had been late to class 3 times, but in Gordon's dry, sterilized tone, lateness became repeated disciplinary action. Insubordination, escalation, minor truths became major implications. Key facts vanished under sleepy language. By the time Gordon finished, the room had stopped pretending this was a trial. It was just a script, one they'd rehearsed too many times. The defense attorney, Cynthia Rowe, sat hunched beside Marlon like she was trying to shrink out of sight. Her papers were out of order, hands shaking as she stood. She didn't even state her name. She didn't challenge the lack of evidence, didn't push back on the exaggerated school record, didn't mention the missing surveillance footage or the complete absence of a physical link. Instead, she looked down at her notes, then up, almost apologetically, and muttered, "We asked the court to view this as youthful misjudgment." That was IT'd, and no fire, no fight, just a whisper of leniency, tossed into a storm that had already passed. Marlon sat beside her in silence. Not because he was guilty, but because he could see, in every face around him, that the decision had already been made. Not in words that postured, silence, that the ritual of watching a boy be turned into a statistic before he even spoke. IT wasn't a defense. IT was a white flag dressed in a blazer. When Cynthia Rowe asked the court to see Marlon's case as youthful misjudgment, the words didn't rise. They sank like stones in water. Not a single head turned. No reaction from the benches. This courtroom had long stopped pretending to care about the nuance of innocence. Everyone in the room had seen this play before. They knew the lines, the silence, the ending. The script never changed. Barry Knox didn't flinch through any of it. Not until Marlon, seated and shackled, shifted ever so slightly, just enough to glance back at the gallery. One brief motion. That was enough. Barry took a step forward, quiet, deliberate, that he reached down and rested his hand on the chain between the cuffs. Just enough pressure to keep Marlon pinned to the bench. Not harsh, not loud, but firm. IT spoke a language everyone in the room understood, that you're only allowed to move when I say so. You belong to the silence. Marlon clenched his teeth. His arms tense beneath the pressure. He swallowed the fire rising in his throat. His eyes, rimmed red from holding back, stayed dry. Rage has a way of hollowing out the tears. Behind him, silence tightened like a noose that a woman in her 40s shook her head slowly, more tired than angry that a teenager gripped his phone like a lifeline, thumb hovering over the record button, but didn't press it. The white couple near the back shifted in their seats and looked down, as if shame could be dodged by avoiding eye contact. Then, the back door opened in a bang. No disruption, just a soft click and a breath of cold air. A black woman stepped inside. She wasn't loud. She didn't announce herself. She didn't walk in like a storm. She walked in like a truth, undeniable, unstoppable, and already written. Her coat was dark, sleek. In one arm she carried a folder thick with documents, its navy blue spine neat and clipped. Her hair was tied back, her face bare. There was no performance in her presence, just purpose. She didn't look around, didn't pause to check for permission. She looked directly at Marlon. And in that single moment, Barry turned. Not because she spoke, not because she shouted, but because something shifted in the air, an instinct, primal and sharp, that told him, this isn't someone you can control. She wasn't familiar to anyone in the room, not on paper. No badge, no title, no hint of official duty. Just a woman walking through sacred ground like she'd already been there 1,000 times. Zara Quinn, 5'5". Still, measured, intentional. She moved through the courtroom with the kind of confidence that made insecure men bristle. She took her place near the front, close to the lawyer's bench, and stood with her arms at her sides. She didn't touch the folder again. She didn't speak. She didn't even blink excessively. She just stood in a place built on whispered apologies and cautious gestures. Her silence cracked the air, like glass under pressure. The courtroom didn't erupt. It recoiled. People noticed her without meaning to. Notary Public Paul Nguyen looked up from his clipboard, squinting before quickly glancing back down. Tessa Monroe, the court clerk, paused mid-keystroke. Even Officer Nico Reed, the younger guard near the far exit, shifted his stance and turned his face slightly to the wall. N01 addressed her, and O1 dared ask her to leave. Not because she was threatening, but because she was too calm, too rooted, too sure of herself. That kind of stillness doesn't come from training. It comes from knowing you're right and not needing the room's permission to act like it. She didn't look lost. She looked like the only one who knew exactly what was coming next. In a place where compliance had become the native language, Zara Quinn spoke a fluent, elegant silence. She didn't raise her chin, didn't tighten her posture, but everything about the way she stood made it clear she would not yield. And that, not yielding, was the most dangerous thing a person could do in Barry Knox's courtroom. Barry was used to subtle submission. Heads dipped, shoulders slumped, voices softened to please authority. That's how the order of things held together. It wasn't law that held this place in place. It was learned helplessness. And yet here was this woman, spine straight, gaze leveled like a mirror. She didn't challenge him. She didn't ignore him. She simply behaved as though he wasn't the one in charge. That was enough to make his skin crawl. His voice, usually a tool finely honed to manipulate space, came out strained. "Who do you think you are?" No reply. Instead, Zara gently set her folder down on the edge of the rail. She opened it with deliberate grace. No rustle, no rush, and slid a single document from its sleeve. She held it calmly against her chest, eyes still fixed forward. The judge, Everett Lang, a man more comfortable with routine than disruption, squinted from behind the bench. He reached for his glasses with shaky fingers, unsure whether this was a mistake or something he'd been warned might one day arrive. That Barry's frown deepened. The silence was too long, too thick, that he moved in, quicker now, like a boulder rolling downhill. He stepped directly in her line of sight, standing between her and the bench like a barricade. His boots planted firmly, his hand hovering over his belt in a show of dominance he'd used on street corners, school protests, even grieving mothers. "I asked you a question," he said, voice now sharpened with insulted pride. Zara didn't shift her weight. She didn't challenge him. She simply stepped a half pace to the side. No contact, no avoidance, just clarity of path. And without lifting a finger, She broke the shape of his power. The courtroom hushed again, not in fear, but in attention. Something was shifting. It wasn't her presence alone. It was her refusal to perform the expected dance. Barry felt the walls closing in, not around her, but around him. The authority he'd worn like armor now felt like an oversized coat. Heavy, fragile at the seams, his face flushed. His neck tightened. "You don't have clearance," he hissed. "This is official business. You have no reason to be standing there." A chair creaked near the back that a young officer picked up his radio, waiting for the nod. Barry waved him down, jaw tight, that he would handle this. "Who the hell do you think you are? Walking in here like this is yours." His voice cracked just slightly at the end. Zara finally lifted her eyes to his. The light from a narrow courtroom window caught her features. The soft curve of fatigue beneath her eyes, a small scar along her brow, and a stillness that didn't come from inexperience, but knowing too much. She wasn't angry. She wasn't smug. She simply knew. Barry stood close enough now to hear her breathing. Steady, low, even. And for the first time in years, he hesitated, because silence in this room usually meant submission. But her silence wasn't bending. It was resisting. And resistance this calm? That was terrifying. In his world, silence meant weakness. Silence meant control. But her silence made him feel naked. Oh, he did what men like him always do when they feel power slipping. He reached, his hand extended, toward her shoulder, toward her coat. He wasn't even sure what he meant to do. Push, remove, assert. He just needed to prove to himself, to the room, that he could still touch power without consequence. But just as his fingers hovered inches from her fabric, a sharp voice cut through the stillness behind him. "I wouldn't." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Because the tone said everything. Barry froze, his hand hovered in the air, inches from the woman who refused to bow. Everyone turned. That a wooden chair struck the floor with a hollow crack. The noise echoed, sharp as a gunshot in a library. A gasp came next, then silence. But it wasn't ordinary silence. It was the sound of a room holding its breath. Not out of shock, but because it sensed something irreversible had just begun, and standing at the center of it, Barry Knox, once the immovable wall of this courtroom, was unraveling. He didn't feel his composure slip. It shattered in real time. His control had always lived in the space between stares and silence. But Zara Quinn's gaze? It didn't lower. It didn't blink. It didn't care who he was. And that was what finally broke him. She didn't wear a badge. She hadn't arrived with an entourage or media coverage. She wasn't supposed to matter. And yet here she was, unmoved, unbent, and entirely unmoved by his presence. Barry lashed out. Not calculated. Not tactical. It came from something raw. The cornered instinct of a man watching his false kingdom burn. "You walk in here to defend this criminal? This garbage?" He snarled, spittle catching in his beard. "You people are the disease, parasites on a system that's already dying." The words didn't just fall. They tore from his throat. Unfiltered, unforgivable. Time stopped. Not metaphorically, literally. The room stiffened like a painting in mid-stroke. No gavel struck. No one coughed. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to pause. An elderly woman in the second row dropped her prayer beads. That a young man reached for his phone, eyes wide with disbelief, but stopped short of recording. He didn't know if it was fear or reverence or simply the sense that something sacred was about to be said. Zara didn't flinch, didn't wince, didn't raise her voice. She simply turned, not toward Barry, but toward Judge Everett Lang, who had sunk further into his robes like a man wishing to be swallowed by the bench. "With respect, Your Honor," she said calmly, "the man you just heard insult a child has no authority to define truth in this courtroom." Her tone wasn't dramatic. There was no performance in it. But her voice carried, not because it was loud, but because it belonged here. She wasn't defending just her brother. She was defending what justice was supposed to mean. "My name is Zara Quinn. I'm the newly appointed chief of police. I was sworn in this morning. And that boy," she gestured to Marlon James, still handcuffed and staring ahead like stone, "has not been convicted of anything. He's 17. No priors. No fair hearing. No chance to be heard. She turned her eyes, finally, toward Barry. You do not get to call him a thief. And you certainly don't get to call us trash. Her words didn't bounce off the courtroom walls. They settled into them, like nails in old wood. Barry took a step back. Instinctively, he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was her voice. Maybe it was the fact that no one stood to defend him, or maybe it was the unshakable truth that she had just said everything he had no answer for. His face twitched. Hands curled into fists. His body, trained to suppress unrest on the streets, now struggled not to tremble in front of a woman who hadn't raised a finger, but had somehow unraveled him completely. Zara saw it. She saw the micro movements, the tightening jaw, the twitch in his wrist, the way his weight shifted to his toes like a boxer ready to swing. Suppression was his native tongue. When power couldn't speak anymore, it punched. Quietly, Zara pressed her foot against the folder she'd laid down earlier, her balance shifting, grounding herself in the seconds before a blow. It wasn't feared, it was readiness. The atmosphere changed. Not dramatically, like a crack in stained glass, subtle, but irreversible. The stenographer paused mid-keystroke, a bead of sweat tracing his temple. The prosecutor, Gordon Price, shifted in his seat for the first time all morning, eyes now cautiously trained. On Barry, the young bailiff, Nico Reed, glanced toward Judge Lang, waiting for instruction that wasn't coming. A woman whispered near the back. Something's about to happen. Nobody answered, because everyone felt it, the collapse of the old order. Not with a shout, not with a verdict, but with the quiet audacity of a woman refusing to be afraid. There was a shift in the air, small but unmistakable. Not a stampede, not chaos, just tension curling itself around the crowd like smoke at a thumb adjusted on a phone screen, at a breath caught in a throat. A man's hand gripped the edge of a bench. They weren't preparing to leave. They were bracing for whatever was about to break. In less than a minute, what had started as a routine hearing, one of dozens that day, had become something else. The courtroom, once draped in sleepy bureaucracy, now stood as a theater of reckoning, where truth had walked in, uninvited but undeniable. Barry Knox, the longtime courtroom enforcer, stood frozen at the front. His chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. His fists trembled in slow, tense spasms. He looked at Zara Quinn like a man staring at a puzzle he'd never been taught to solve. She didn't tremble. She didn't yell. She just looked at him, and in that gaze was a terrifying calm. Zara wasn't wielding authority. She was authority. Not the kind stamped on badges or printed on paper. The kind that comes when a person walks in with nothing to prove and everything to expose. Barry had screamed. He'd branded her, her brother, and everyone like them as garbage. But she hadn't backed down. She'd spoken the language he thought he controlled, the law, and made it her weapon. It was the first time in years someone had turned the system against him without lifting a finger. And in that moment, Barry wasn't the law. He was the one it had come for. He took a step back. He was small, subtle. But it happened. Zara saw it. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply let it be known. She had already won. The judge, Everett Lang, finally tapped his gavel. Once weak, would without conviction. Order, he rasped. Please, order. But his voice was hollow, like a bell rung in an empty temple. It didn't command. It begged. And no one moved. Because the real center of gravity wasn't the bench anymore. It was the man trembling at its edge. Barry's breath had become a roar in his own ears. He couldn't hear the shuffling feet or the murmurs from the gallery. He couldn't even hear the gavel anymore. All he could feel was the suffocating pressure in his chest. The weight of loss, not of a trial, but of dominance he was unraveling. His hands clenched again, then opened, then clenched. Something inside him was twitching, something old, primal, trained but never challenged. Zara didn't move. She didn't prepare to run. She simply shifted her heel a few centimeters, grounded herself. That it wasn't self-defense, that it was certainty. She knew that he was going to strike. And then it happened in no warning. No escalation. Just violence. Barry twisted. Shoulders dipped, knee rose, and with all the rage of a man whose mask had finally fallen, he lashed out. His boot found its mark, a brutal, upward kick driven by panic and fury. It struck Zara square in the chest. A sickening, blunt sound filled the courtroom. Not a crack, not a scream, just a dull thud, like flesh meeting concrete. Zara staggered. Her folder skidded across the floor. Papers flew, like confessions released from their envelope. The room didn't erupt, it stilled. Not because people didn't care, but because the act had been so raw, so out of place, so damning, it left the human brain a second too slow to comprehend that a woman in the front row gasped, a chair screeched back violently. Someone whispered, "Did he just?" But no one had filmed, and one had spoken fast enough. The kick had come like a reflex, not tactical, not legal, animal. And that was the moment everything changed because Barry Knox hadn't kicked a protester. He hadn't subdued a threat, he had attacked the chief of police. Unprovoked, unarmed, standing on nothing but her own quiet conviction. And in doing so, he hadn't just broken the rules of conduct, he had revealed the true face of the power he'd always wielded. Not law, not order, but fear in uniform. The courtroom was no longer a courtroom, that it was a crime scene. And Barry, once the symbol of order, now stood as the evidence that a single breath shifted the room. Not a word, not a protest, just a breath held, tight, shared by everyone. The courtroom, once numb and procedural, was now wide awake. Not by law, not by verdict, but by violence. The kick hadn't echoed off alley bricks or patrol room walls, that it landed in the heart of a justice chamber, beneath marble plaques and aging wood, in front of a judge, a prosecutor, officers, citizens that had blown not thrown in fear or defense, but entitlement. And Barry Knox, the man whose boot struck a woman carrying nothing but a file and resolve, didn't flinch that he stood there, like a man who still believed the world would nod and look away, like they always had. This wasn't brutality to him. It was restoration, that a reminder of who owned the room. Zara Quinn hit the floor without theatrics, in dramatic fall, in scream. Just a sickening, dull collision between body and bench, the kind of sound that haunted silence more than it did ears. Pages from her file fluttered into the aisle, light as air and twice as damning. Charcoal sketches of wrongdoing, affidavits, internal complaints. Secrets meant for evidence now spilled like feathers beneath fluorescent light. And still, she didn't scream. Her breath caught one palm planted on the tile. Another gripped her side, but her jaw remained set. Barry watched, frozen, the pose of a man who believed he had one hand resting near his holster, the other hovering uselessly. As if confused the moment wasn't over yet, he had expected chaos. Or panic. Or surrender, he got none of it. What unnerved him wasn't Zara's words. It was her silence, the kind that carried not fear, but calculation. And then she began to move. Not with urgency. Not with wounded pride, but deliberately one page. Then another. Gathering her scattered documents like someone recovering a dropped sword in the middle of a battlefield. And tears. In retaliation. Just presence, that's when the shift happened. Not in noise, but in eyes that a man in the back lowered his phone, guilt washing over him. The stenographer's fingers froze above his keyboard, trembling like a man watching a legend unravel. The judge sat motionless, gavel still in hand, as if unsure whether it had any meaning left. Even prosecutor Ames, usually half asleep during these rituals, had leaned forward, his face pale, his lips slightly parted, unsure whether he'd just witnessed a breach of protocol or a historic line crossed. Zara slowly rose, one hand still cradling her ribs, the other gripping the stack of documents now smudged by court dust. Her back wasn't straight. It was anchored as if pain had weight but not power. She didn't speak right away. She looked at Barry Knox, who stood across from her, chest puffed and nostrils flaring, and she saw him. Not the uniform, not the reputation, just a man unraveling. Then, without changing her tone, without raising her volume, she spoke. If this, she motioned faintly to the bruise forming across her collar, can happen here, in a court of law, beneath the seal of justice, in plain view of a judge and officers, She let the silence carry her next words like smoke curling into every corner of the room. What happens in places without witnesses? Without cameras? Without a name badge to defend you? The words weren't aimed only at him. They were aimed through him, into the gallery, into the court, into everyone who'd ever looked away. Murmurs died in throats. Eyes lowered. Hearts beat faster. IT wasn't rage. She delivered. IT was truth. Carved in a stone. Zara looked to the judge, then to the prosecutor, then finally to Barry again. You didn't just strike me, she said quietly. You struck the illusion that you were still in control. Barry didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, but because there was no script left to follow. He clenched his jaw again, the tremor in his knuckles returning. But it was different now. Not power pulsing through him, but panic because she was still standing. And that meant everything he had relied on, all the years of silence, fear, complicity, was beginning to crack, somewhere in the back. A recording had finally begun. A soft beep. A red light blinking. Someone had decided to bear witness. And in the heart of it all, Zara stood, still holding those papers, creased, scattered, but intact, just like her. The courtroom wasn't quiet anymore. IT was charged. Not with chaos, but consequence, and a one followed up. No questions. No clarifications. Because deep down, everyone knew. The moment Zara Quinn rose to her feet and said who she was, the room had already shifted. The courtroom wasn't just a venue for trial anymore. It had become a reckoning. And Barry Knox, once the immovable force of that room, now stood hollowed out. Not posturing, not sneering, just still. His stare stayed locked on that stamped document in Zara's hand, as if a piece of paper had undone 2 decades of unchallenged power. His lips parted once, maybe to speak, maybe to bark something like he used to, but nothing came out. Around him, people turned their eyes away, not from fear, but from clarity. The shield of fear that had protected Barry all these years had been peeled off in a single moment of silence. There was no rescue coming, not from the court, not from colleagues, not even from the system that used to shelter men like him. He was alone in a room full of people who finally saw him for what he was. Zara didn't gloat. She didn't flex her new title. She stood with a steady breath, pain still flickering behind her ribs, but her gaze unwavering. She had no need to scream or curse. Her presence alone, the fact she rose and spoke plainly, was louder than a screams. That's when the true trial ended. Not with a verdict, not with the judge's gavel, but with a woman standing tall after being knocked down, speaking not just for herself, but for every shadow that had ever tried to scream through silence. Within hours, the fallout began. A grainy phone recording, shaky, distant, but unmistakable, had made its way online. The footage showed the moment Barry Knox lashed out with his boot, driving it into Zara Quinn's chest with practiced violence. There was no flashy headline needed. The image told its own story. A black woman rising to speak, then being thrown down by the very badge meant to protect her. The caption on the first viral post was simple: Zara Quinn, chief of police, kicked in court by her own officer. That was enough. The video didn't stay a single post. It mutated, spread. People trimmed it, slowed it, added captions. Each second dissected like evidence in a case now too big for the courtroom. Users froze the frame where Barry's jaw clenched, where his boot lifted. They pulled the audio, his seething line, "You people are society's trash," and looped it over shots of civil rights marches, over news clips of wrongful arrests. That a storm of hashtags emerged. Hashtag badge and boot, hashtag Quinn did not flinch, hashtag the Kikikinti take back. Then came the voices. Not official ones. The internet didn't wait for them. Anonymous accounts dragged up old videos. One in particular, a training seminar recording from years ago, caught fire. Barry's voice was clear. Force is the only language some people understand. The law slows you down. That clip alone had over 2 million views in the first 24 hours. And the memes? Ruthless. A slowed-down mid-kick freeze frame of Barry was captioned. "This you?" Side by side with another meme showing his police commendation plaque, from honor to horror in one frame. The Millstone Police Department's social media became a war zone. Comments flooded every post, even the old ones about school visits and safety drills. Tell us how proud you are of Knox now. So, your training includes chest-kicking women in court? But the outrage wasn't universal. In chat rooms, private message chains, and suburban group pages, defense of Barry Knox grew fast and vicious. They didn't try to erase what happened. They reframed it. An officer under stress. An overreaction to provocation. In some forums, they leaned harder, calling Zara's rise a political stunt. A setup. She knew the cameras were rolling. A Facebook group named Hold the Line for Officer Barry ballooned to 15,000 members in 2 days. They posted old, smiling photos of him at neighborhood events. One post read, "He saved my daughter when she broke her leg. He doesn't deserve this trial by social media." A YouTube video labeled Zara Quinn, Chief or Chaos, stitched together misleading clips, painting her as unstable, emotionally driven, dangerous in uniform. It amassed 300K views in 36 hours. The divide widened. Mainstream networks tried to remain measured, but on social platforms, the battle lines had hardened. One side called Knox a monster in uniform. The other called Zara a calculated player in a racial power grab. Caught in the middle was the legal system. Faced with the viral chaos and intense media pressure, the court issued a brief but monumental announcement. The trial of Marlon James, accused of theft, is hereby suspended until further notice. The environment no longer supports a fair and impartial proceeding. In '01 missed the irony. The trial that started as a quiet footnote in Millstone's calendar was now international news. But it wasn't about stolen property anymore. It was about stolen dignity, stolen silence, and a system forced to stare at itself. Not in the pages of a ruling, but in the frame of a video that wouldn't stop playing. And at the center of it all, not a politician, not a protester, but a woman who refused to fall quietly. Zara Quinn had stood up, and now the whole country had to decide what to do with that, and '01 needed to spell it out. The trial wasn't paused because of procedural concerns. It was because of the kick. Everyone in that courtroom knew it. Yet not a single official statement mentioned violence or assault. They wrapped it in legal phrasing, but the truth had already made its rounds in pixels and hashtags. This time, the story didn't disappear into redacted reports or late-night city council memos. This time, Millstone couldn't look away. The moment had been captured, multiplied, and sent back to them with the volume turned up, and this time, the sound wouldn't be silenced. Zara Quinn didn't show up on camera. She didn't do interviews. There were no podiums, no rehearsed apologies, no made-for-TV gestures. In her first week as chief of police, she made one move. She went straight to the fourth floor. Internal affairs. Citizen complaints. The locked drawers where paperwork goes to die. The first document she signed wasn't about promotions or reshuffling departments. It was a sweeping review, a full audit of every incident involving Officer Barry Knox over the past 12 years. Within 48 hours, a thick packet landed on her desk. 14 formal complaints, all stamped the same. Internal suspension. No outcomes. No disciplinary notes. No conclusions. 9 were never entered into the department's digital archives. 3 existed only as fading hard copies. 1 was filed under initials. Another was just missing. Zara sat for hours reading each one. 8 came from civilians in lower-income neighborhoods. 3 were from arrestees accused of resisting. 2 came from independent attorneys. But 1 stood out. A rookie cop had filed a report claiming Knox had pressured him to falsify procedure. After filing, the officer requested a transfer and then promptly resigned. Zara had the complaint dates compared with the department's award log. The pattern was sickening. 11 of those complaints aligned exactly with the same months Knox received medals or commendations. Officer of the Quarter, outstanding crime reduction. Each celebration mirrored a silencing. A reward paired with a redacted truth. One file read, "I was held for hours after closing without a lawyer. Officer Knox told me, if you don't sign, I'll make you disappear." Another, from a single mother, was brief. He asked if I wanted my son to stay in school. I understood what he meant. Zara didn't rage. She didn't make threats. She just walked down into the department basement. No cameras followed. Just dust, forgotten files, rusted paper clips. She spent hours sifting through records, some handwritten, others faded with age. But the patterns were clear. There wasn't some grand conspiracy. No forged evidence or illegal orders. Just a long, deliberate system of inaction. Enough silence to bury 100 truths. And now, someone was finally digging them up. Among the dust and silence, a single name rose unexpectedly, not in a file, but in conversation. Kevin Simmons, 16, a student at the same school as Marlon James. Not a friend, not even a classmate, just a kid who happened to be riding home from the library on his bike that morning, past the same marketplace that he saw it. James Brooks, the old man who always sat by the bus stop, was robbed by someone in a black hoodie. But seconds later, a second teen tore past on a bike, chasing the thief down an alley. That teen was Marlon. A few minutes later, Marlon returned, panting, watch in hand. He gave it back to Mr. Brooks without a word. But when the police rolled up, they didn't ask for details. They saw a young black teen, sweating, standing next to an elderly man and a stolen object. The cuffs came out. The story had already been decided. Kevin watched it all and said nothing. Not because he didn't care, but because he assumed someone else would fix it. Because he thought adults would know better. That's what they were for, right? It wasn't until Kevin saw the video of Zara Quinn, the woman who'd been kicked across a courtroom, that he understood. The system wasn't going to fix itself. And the boy who chased the real thief? He was still in a cell. Kevin sat in his room that night, replaying what he'd seen. Not just the robbery, but the silence that followed. The wrong name on the police report. The way Marlon never shouted, never begged. Like he already knew no one would believe him. Kevin opened his laptop, and for the first time, he typed it out. Kevin Simmons had never spoken much in class. The kind of student who blended into the walls, quiet, observant, eyes always somewhere else. But after the courtroom clip of Zara Quinn being kicked circled every screen he passed, something inside him turned. It wasn't rage. It wasn't pity. It was the memory that wouldn't leave him alone. A loop of errand. No, Marlon James, pedaling like hell after the man who actually took that watch. It took Kevin 3 days to work up the nerve. When he finally approached his homeroom teacher, he didn't make a scene. He just whispered, "If I saw something, but no one ever asked me, does it still matter?" The teacher, caught off guard, did the only thing she could, called Zara Quinn's temporary office. The meeting wasn't flashy. A side room off the school library, still smelling of disinfectant and whiteboard markers. Zara didn't wear her uniform. No badge, no pódio, no lecture. Just a woman sitting across from a boy who had seen something too important to ignore. Kevin spoke quietly, but clearly. He described the real thief. Stocky, a scar that pulled his neck skin tight, and a black hoodie with a missing drawstring. He described the bus stop, the way Marlon had flown past him on his bike, nearly tipping over. He remembered the produce store a few feet down, where a surveillance camera always pointed outward like a third eye. Zara didn't interrupt. She didn't soften her expression to make him comfortable. She just wrote, fast and focused. When he finished, she simply said, "You just gave my brother the chance to be seen as something other than a suspect." That means everything. What Kevin didn't know was that his memory cracked the case open. That produce shop? The owner hadn't even waited for police. He'd saved the footage the moment he noticed something weird. 2 kids, one chasing the other, no officers asking questions. It hadn't been uploaded. It wasn't crisp, but it was enough that Zara's team enhanced it frame by frame. There he was, a short man with a crooked stride and a glint of metal at his wrist. The thief. Then, seconds later, Marlon, panting, skidding to a stop, returning the watch to Mr. Brooks with both hands in no hesitation. No theft, no guilt, and yet, none of that had mattered the day Officer Barry Knox arrived at the scene. For a decade, Barry Knox operated on reflex. Not on facts, not on process. Reflex. It made him fast, decisive, feared, and, until recently, untouchable. Knox didn't need backup when he patrolled the South Side. His confidence was treated as courage. His bluntness called discipline. His brutality labeled efficiency. His reports were always the same. Minimal resistance, subject subdued, no injuries worth noting. and when civilians protested. The paperwork vanished into a drawer marked IA follow-up. Every promotion he received came with a commendation that curiously matched a fresh complaint. But it didn't matter. The system didn't check for patterns. It only rewarded results that made headlines. The morning of Marlon's arrest, it was business as usual. Knox responded in less than 2 minutes. Saw a black teen, out of breath, holding stolen property. No other witness in sight. It was enough. His grip twisted Marlon's wrist until it popped. A knee pressed into the boy's shoulder blade before a single question was asked. Knox never considered there might be another side to the story. His report was typed up before Marlon's voice even entered the evidence log. Suspect found at scene. Uncooperative. Object recovered. Threat neutralized. By sundown, his supervisor texted, "Solid instinct. Appreciate you.by sunrise." He was a nominee for Officer of the Quarter. He slept like it was any other day. What he didn't know was that the days of silence were over. That Kevin's statement, the saved footage, and the quietly reopened files on his past cases were starting to stack higher than the medals he kept framed in his office. And Zara Quinn? She wasn't going to announce a takedown. She was building it, slow, methodical, like someone who knew exactly what it looked like when a system protected its abusers. The difference now, she wasn't part of it anymore. She was standing above it, and she wasn't blinking. The courtroom was packed in a way that hadn't happened in years. Not for a mayoral scandal, not even for the trial of a corrupt city contractor. This wasn't about crime anymore. It was about what the city had become and what it might still become. Outside, the streets around Millstone's municipal courthouse were lined with protest signs and camera crews. Inside, tension folded itself into every whisper and shuffled foot. But no one was watching the judge or the attorneys. Every eye was on the teenage boy walking toward the stand, Marlon James. His steps were small, but his presence was enormous. His hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight of something he'd carried too long without the right to explain himself. Zara Quinn sat quietly behind him, eyes forward, face composed. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She didn't have to. Her presence alone had reshaped the silence in that courtroom. Marlon took the oath, his voice steady but low, and sat. The prosecutor, Gordon Price, barely looked up from his notes. He didn't see a boy. He saw a case to salvage. But the courtroom no longer belonged to him. The first question was routine, but Marlon didn't answer like a kid who'd been rehearsed. He answered like someone who had waited too long to be believed. "I didn't steal that watch," he said, his voice echoing faintly. "And where were you when the incident occurred?" Price asked. "I was chasing the guy who did steal it," Marlon replied. "I gave the watch back. Ask Mr. Brooks. Ask anyone who was there." Whispers surged through the gallery. Someone murmured, "That's what the video showed." Price tried to regain control, but the momentum was slipping. The defense, Cynthia Rowe, didn't even object. She knew the court was finally listening. In the third row, Zara sat with a folder in her lap, sealed but no longer needed. Everything that mattered now was out in the open. Outside, a large screen set up by activists played the surveillance clip on loop. A tattooed man grabbing something. A teenager on a bike chasing him. An elderly man holding out his hand, then nodding in thanks. It played silently, but it screamed truth louder than any witness. Meanwhile, Barry Knox, formerly known as a reliable enforcer, a man who once made rooms hold their breath when he entered, was nowhere to be found. Suspended pending investigation, he had disappeared from the courthouse circuit, stripped not just of his title, but of the fear that once protected him. He was a name on a docket now, a case file, just another file in Zara Quinn's growing stack of overdue reckonings. In that moment, the trial wasn't just about Marlon's innocence anymore. It was about how a system could twist a boy's life into a statistic and call it order, and how, sometimes, it only takes one woman standing back up after being kicked down, refusing to disappear, for that order to finally collapse. The judge, Everett Lang, leaned forward. "We'll recess until this footage is officially reviewed by the court," he announced. But everyone in the room already knew how this ended. The trial wasn't waiting for the system anymore. It had passed its verdict in the hearts of everyone present. Zara closed her folder, and stood. Marlon didn't look back at her. He didn't have to. They both understood. The law hadn't changed. But this time, it didn't win. Dressed in a crisp white button-down, Marlon James sat upright in the witness chair. His frame looked smaller than his age, his face lean, but his eyes didn't dip anymore. Not like they used to in the early days after the arrest, when every gaze felt like a sentence and every question carried an accusation. Today was different. Today, for the first time, he would speak his full truth without being silenced, interrupted, or rewritten. At the back of the courtroom stood Zara Quinn, not among the attorneys, not at the bench, not even next to Marlon. She positioned herself in what court clerks casually referred to as the neutral zone. But there was nothing neutral about her presence. Her posture, quiet and composed, cut through the room like a blade. No badge on display, no press lanyard, just a woman who had once been knocked down in this same chamber and now stood to bear witness. The case file sat before the judge, complete for the first time. It included footage from a vegetable shop, security footage that had nearly been lost. In it, a shorter black man in a hooded sweatshirt darts in a frame and yanks a watch from the wrist of Mr. James Brooks. Seconds later, another young man, Marlon, appears, pedaling hard after him. No weapons, no struggle, no theft. Just pursuit, recovery, and return. The thief had a distinct mark behind his ear, a tattoo, like a crescent slice. Marlon didn't. The grainy footage didn't lie. He hadn't taken anything. He had returned something, but when officers arrived that day, they didn't look for tattoos or ask for names. They saw sweat on dark skin and a watch in the wrong hand. It was enough. They had their story before they even wrote it down. Mr. Brooks, the elderly man in the footage, took the stand next. His voice was faint but unwavering. "Yes, it was him," he said, pointing toward Marlon. "That boy right there gave it back to me." He even apologized for not catching the man who stole it. Not a defense strategy, not a lawyer's speech, just a victim finally asked the question he was never given before. Next was Kevin Simmons, Marlon's classmate. Just 16. He looked terrified, like he wanted to disappear inside his too big shirt. But when he spoke, his words held shape. "I saw it. I saw everything. I thought the adults would fix it." His eyes lowered. That silence after he finished, it wasn't just quiet. It was loaded. Like everyone in the courtroom was holding a mirror and realizing they hadn't looked into it soon enough. The footage, the eyewitnesses, the long overdue evidence, all submitted not by accident, but because Zara had pushed. She had knocked on doors, asked hard questions, chased rumors, and reopened files that the department had let rot. Without her, it all would have slipped through the cracks, swallowed by apathy and red tape. And in that moment, the story no longer belonged to the institutions. It wasn't about courtroom procedure or chain of command. It was raw truth, finally free from the backrooms and the denials. The kind of truth that forces the whole city to pause. When Marlon's name was called for the last time, it didn't carry the weight of suspicion. It came out clear. No hesitation, no matter the assumptions. Just a name. A young man finally seen as someone worth listening to. He stepped down from the stand, not as an accused, but as a citizen reclaiming what had been denied to him. Dignity, as he passed, he looked toward his sister. Zara didn't beam with pride. She didn't raise her fist in triumph. She offered only a calm nod, almost imperceptible. For her, this wasn't celebration. It was responsibility, a promise kept. One more crack sealed in a system she now had the power to challenge from within. Marlon was officially cleared. Charges dropped. Name wiped clean. But when the courtroom emptied and Zara made her way into the hallway, something twisted faintly in her gut. It wasn't a sound. It was a stare that she'd felt it before, years ago when she worked internal affairs. A kind of gaze that didn't follow protocol or debate facts. It lingered like smoke, hanging too long in the corners of silence. Most people didn't even notice it. But Zara always did. It was the look of someone who had lost control of the narrative and was desperate to take it back. Third-floor corridor, near the rusted emergency stairwell window. Zara had passed through that hallway 100 times before, but this time, someone stood there as if rooted to the linoleum tiles. Barry Knox, that he wasn't storming the courtroom. He wasn't shouting down the hallway. He was just there, wrapped in a plain gray coat, hands sunken into his pockets, chin dipped just enough to shadow his expression, but not his stare. His eyes didn't follow Zara's movements with anger or shame. They clung to her spine like nails. The look wasn't haunted. It was architectural, calculating, like a man watching the blueprints of his own empire catch fire and wondering what parts of the ash he could still stack. That a man, possibly another officer, maybe just a relic of the same old guard, stepped beside Knox, then paused. He'd overheard it, the low growl slipping from Barry's lips, quiet but certain. "You think this is over? It's just begun." He didn't say it to anyone in particular. Not the man beside him. Not Zara. Maybe not even aloud. It was the kind of threat meant for the walls. For the air. For anyone who remembered what kind of man Barry Knox had always been. At the next evening, Zara left the precinct late. Not because she was scared, but because she knew something had shifted, and that shift required her to prepare, not react. The headquarters lights blinked out behind her, one floor at a time, and she slipped into the soft dark of South Millstone streets. She didn't drive. She never did on days like this. Walking grounded her, reminded her of who the system was supposed to serve. The road to her apartment wasn't far. Less than a mile of uneven sidewalk, shuttered stores, and old neon signs that buzzed louder than they glowed. But that night, something didn't hum right. The silence was too still. The kind of stillness that didn't belong to cities. Something waited, either ahead or behind. She noticed it around the corner near the auto shop, the sudden snarl of an engine. Not a casual bike ride or kid scooter. A motorcycle, heavy and close. Then came the figures, 3 of them, melting out from the broken brick backdrop of an abandoned gas station. Covered faces, thick gloves, no weapons in hand, but none needed. The way they walked said enough. Men who hit first, ask never. The one in the center had a snake tattoo slithering up his wrist. His gaze latched on Zara like a wolf clocking its prey. And in that look, she saw exactly what this was. Not a robbery. A message. Zara didn't run. She calculated. Left alley, dumpster. Behind that, a leaning chain-link fence. She'd used that path once to extract a boy caught in crossfire. Not all memories were for reflection. Some were for survival. With a pivot and a kick, she crashed the dumpster down, scattering metal like alarm bells across the dark. The men flinched. 1 step. 2. She slipped through the fence, coat snagging, knee scraping. But she was gone in less than a minute, swallowed by the factory shadows. When the rapid response unit arrived, there was no trace of the attackers. Just a discarded burner phone beneath a jacaranda tree. No ID, no contacts. Just one chilling message. Friday after 9 p.m. 8th Street. Walks home. Left side. No vehicle. Prefers alone. Every word described her. Every detail a page from a surveillance file she never agreed to be in. Tech analysis linked the phrasing to one name. Trevor Carver, a former part-time volunteer during neighborhood safety drills. He'd once run logistics under Knox. The sentence structures matched old civil patrol playbooks. No signature, no orders. But Zara didn't need his name on paper to recognize his fingerprints. Knox had taught them well how to operate just inside the boundary of legality. How to move through a system's blind spots like shadows that don't need light to be real. Zara looked at the text, then her reflection in the bus stop glass. And she understood something she hadn't admitted until now. The war was never going to be fought in courtrooms. The IT would be fought in alleys. In quiet moments. In the spaces where justice used to be a whisper. She called internal oversight. I want every complaint involving retaliation reopened. Go back 8 years. Start with everyone who served beside Barry Knox. Every name, every squad. One file emerged first, buried deep in a drawer, its tab marked. Resisting Officer, 2017. A name, Darius Cole. The report was standard. Subject refused identification during stop. Became aggressive. Necessary restraint applied. Signed by Barry Knox. No video. No external witness. Case resolved. But when Zara cross-checked hospital entries for the same date, She found Darius had checked in with injuries too specific to ignore. 3 broken teeth, bruising across the ribs, a knee torn open like it had met pavement under force. She didn't summon him. She went to the halfway shelter where he now lived in silence. Darius emerged slowly. His gait was off, his jaw crooked, his smile uneven. Zara asked him just one question: "Did you really resist?" He gave a small laugh, lips torn at the corner. "You're the first to ask me that in 7 years." Everyone else just sighed. Within hours, the case was reopened. 8 officers received internal memos. Officers who'd signed off on no misconduct observed. At first, their emails came politely. One asked for clarification, another for delay. Be why the second round. The shift had begun. 2 officers called in for mental health. One transferred. The others? They started whispering. How far back is she going? Suspicion didn't walk in. It spread like spilled ink. In the break room, the hallway, even the shared text chains. Who still believed in Barry Knox's silence? Who was waiting to be exposed? Zara didn't press. She didn't need a confession. She just let them watch the water ripple as the stone fell and died. And then came Lorraine Wexley. She didn't have an online profile. She didn't carry a smartphone. Her voice was raspy with age, but clear. Zara had found her file, half deleted, listed as Mother Unstable. No evidence. Case closed. When Zara visited her, Lorraine answered the door with calm hands and tired eyes. She didn't need prompting. She remembered it all. Her son, Isaiah, 15, standing at a bus stop, not involved in the nearby fight. But when the police screamed for everyone to drop, Isaiah asked why. That question was all it took. Knox pinned him down, pressed his face to the street, burned his skin on hot summer concrete. By the time Lorraine arrived at the station, Isaiah had a busted lip and cuffs on too tight. She filed complaints, had medical proof, even begged a meeting. Nothing happened. They didn't have to pay me, Lorraine said, voice low. I didn't need a trial. I just needed someone to call and say, "We'll look into it." But that call never came. That silence was louder than any slap. She told Zara how Isaiah changed afterward. Quit sports, drop friends, learn to speak less, move quieter. He didn't grow angry, she whispered. He just learned, don't react. Just survive. Zara didn't write anything down. She didn't need to, because Isaiah's story wasn't an exception. It was the map. And now, she had begun retracing every path. Zara didn't speak much during her visit with Lorraine Wexley. She didn't need to. What mattered wasn't said aloud. It was in the way Lorraine's hands trembled as they folded across her lap. Hands that once carried handwritten complaints from one precinct door to another, then quietly tucked those papers into a kitchen drawer because there were dishes to wash, double shifts to work, a son to feed, and no one to believe her. When Zara returned to headquarters, she ordered a deep dive into the archives, targeting any digital trace of Lorraine's 2013 complaint. Hours later, an aging technician handed her an outdated drive labeled Miscellaneous Intake. Tucked inside was a document marked Unofficial Complaint, Wexley. No witness confirmation, no follow-up. But Zara kept digging. She found a faded scan buried in an undeclared subfolder. A photo of Isaiah Wexley's wrists, bruised in clean semicircles where standard cuffs had bitten too tight. A scanned note written in looping penmanship by a school paraprofessional. I saw Isaiah being escorted off campus. He wasn't resisting. He was confused. That letter had never made it into the official file. The system had moved faster than the truth. Barry Knox had already submitted his report. Subject was disruptive, non-compliant, posed potential threat. His version got filed. The teacher's note didn't. The mother's voice didn't. Only the man who wore the badge was allowed to narrate the story. Zara sat back from the desk, the room thick with stillness. Then, with one deliberate keystroke, she changed the case status to reopened. Priority high. Pending investigation for potential historical misconduct. She knew this wouldn't lead to arrests overnight. But for the first time in 12 years, Lorraine Wexley's name existed inside an official record without the phrase insufficient evidence attached to it. To Zara, Each buried complaint wasn't just an old grievance. It was a stolen voice, a truth someone decided didn't matter. And every silenced voice raised a generation of citizens who stopped believing in the concept of justice because justice had once ignored them. But if she could bring even a few of those names back into daylight, then maybe the belief hadn't vanished. Maybe it had just been waiting for someone brave enough to listen. And that's when the shadows began responding. That IT started small. One anonymous envelope slipped under her door. Then 3 more the next week. None had return addresses. Just stiff sheets of printed paper with messages like, "You're opening drawers that were nailed shut for a reason. Protect your rank. You live. Protect the truth. Sometimes you disappear." Point one envelope had nothing inside except a single grainy photo. Her apartment window at night, captured from across the street. She hadn't drawn the blinds. No message. No signature. But she didn't need one. The warning was clear. You are being watched. She didn't report it. Not right away. Because she already knew the source. This wasn't a lone man's paranoia. It was a ripple. Filth washing out from corners where people had long thrived under the old culture of fear. Barry Knox didn't have to do anything himself. He had others willing to do it for him. Officers, allies, old beneficiaries of the very system Zara was now unearthing. The next few days, digital smears surfaced. A rumor circulated that Zara had used her title to settle a family grudge. An anonymous thread on an internal forum claimed she'd once manipulated a precinct vote, resulting in unpaid overtime. No evidence, just enough noise to stir suspicion. Enough for whispers to travel down halls and sit beside officers in break rooms. And sometimes, suspicion is deadlier than bullets. The night before her scheduled release of the first investigation findings, Zara sat alone at her desk. She left the lights on, left the blinds open. If someone was out there watching her window, they'd see her exactly as she was, exhausted but unwavering. Her desk was no longer a workspace. It was a war table. Spread across it were files. The internal affairs summary on Knox. Unpublished witness reports. Kevin Simmons's testimony. The thank you letter from Lorraine, handwritten in purple ink. A red folder labeled, "Witnesses never called." Everything she had uncovered. Everything once discarded. A soft knock broke the silence. The junior officer entered with another envelope. Anonymous, again. This one contained a photocopy of Zara's birth certificate. A red slash had been drawn through her name, and scrawled across the bottom were 5 crooked words. "Whose child are you really?" Zara held the page for a moment, then calmly set it aside. She didn't burn it. She didn't shred it. She simply opened her desktop folder titled Phase 1 Release. She clicked Save, then print point one by one. The pages emerged from a machine. Reports, photos, testimonies once marked inconclusive, names previously buried under case closed. She gathered them into a binder, sealed the front with a label. Preliminary report on departmental misconduct, City of Millstone, 1998 to 2021. That by morning, copies would be delivered to 3 newspapers, the mayor's office, the Federal Oversight Division, and uploaded, per department protocol, onto the public digital board for the Millstone Police Department. That N.O. press stunt, N.O. headline. Just a quiet act of truth. That if even one person saw their name in those pages, someone who had once been written off as a liar, a thug, or a problem, and whispered, "I wasn't crazy, I wasn't alone," then that would be enough for Zara. She wasn't trying to dismantle the system. She was holding up a mirror. If it flinched, if it attacked, then everyone would finally see what had been hidden all along. By dawn, the media room at headquarters overflowed. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder. Activists, retired officers, neighborhood organizers, law students. Not a single person was there because of a press invite. They came because they felt the moment was different. Zara stepped up with no entourage, no podium theatrics, just a single 70-page document and a live screen behind her. She didn't open with a speech. She displayed the map, a full satellite layout of Millstone, color-coded, divided by residential zones. Red dots lit up the screen, each representing a documented arrest over a 23-year span. First, the distribution was random. Then, like blood seeping in a cloth, the dot bled toward the east and south, neighborhoods where over 80% of the population was Black or Latino. The room hushed. Zara let the silence speak. Then she simply said, "This is what the numbers look like when the stories are finally told." Zara zoomed in on one red-hot quadrant. Sector 7, the numbers blinked on screen. 241 arrests in just under 4 years. 196 flagged as potential public order threats. More than 89% were people of color or from immigrant families that or anyone else. It was a spreadsheet. But to Zara, it was a graveyard. Each line of life bent or broken under the pretext of order. Then another window expanded. A name floated to the top in bold. Primary arresting officer, B. Knox. Number of log arrests, 37. The graph below painted a cruel symmetry. His spike in commendations rose exactly in tandem with his arrest numbers. Each uptick in violence had been met with an award, a pat on the back, a promotion. She didn't need to editorialize. The visuals spoke louder than any words. Next came the audio. A grainy recording from a confidential meeting back in 2014. A male voice, tone casual, matter of fact. "We let Knox handle it because he knows how to clean up garbage. And garbage doesn't need protecting." The sentence dropped like a blade into the silence. No one asked what it meant. They knew. Zara stepped away from the podium slightly. Her voice was low, firm. For a long time, we thought order came from volume. From numbers, arrest counts, quick clearances, efficiency. But when numbers are used to excuse brutality, when data becomes a shield for abuse, then those numbers aren't protecting us, they're being used as weapons. Behind her, a new layer of the digital map appeared. This time, every incident was color-coded. Red, use of excessive force. Yellow, complaints filed with no follow-up. Black, cases that disappeared, vanished mid-process, no records, no results. In the center of it all pulsed one word, stamped in blood-red font. Knox. Zone of it didn't close with a call to action. She didn't ask for sympathy or change. Instead, she asked a single question: if Barry Knox hadn't lashed out in that courtroom, if I hadn't stood up from that floor, would any of us be seeing this right now? That kick, once dismissed as a personal flare-up, had become the crack in the dam. It wasn't a fall from grace. It was the truth finally tripping the alarm, and applause followed. But outside the chamber, the internet ignited. Clips of Zara's presentation went viral before the file had even finished uploading. Hashtags emerged like wildfire. Civil rights groups shared the data. Students reshared the map. Former arrestees came forward with their own forgotten stories. Her name appeared alongside headlines she never asked for. The cop who dared to speak against the badge. The system's own weapon now aimed at itself. But within 12 hours, the gears of containment began to turn, small at first. Regional media outlets started receiving polite but chilling emails. Not legal notices, not demands, just a repeated line. "We suggest temporarily removing content related to material not yet verified by the appropriate oversight channels." Some stations received late-night phone calls. The voices on the line weren't from Millstone PD. They weren't even from City Hall. They were from the State Internal Affairs Liaison Office, the same office Zara had no power over. Their tone was surgical. "Please avoid creating instability in multi-ethnic neighborhoods. Let's wait for the official process before shaping perception. Avoid turning an individual into a political symbol." Sounded reasonable, sensible even, but underneath was a clear command. Stop. Step back. Do not provoke the system. By morning, half the online videos of her briefing were gone. Some flagged as unverified. Others removed for content violations. When Millstone's communications team reached out for clarification, no one could say who issued the takedowns. No account. No face, just silence, strategic silence. And then a whisper from the inside, an anonymous message leaked from the state government's press coordination office. The contents: pause all disclosures related to Officer Barry Knox. The investigation is active. Letting the media lead will create a dangerous precedent. Zara stared at those two final words. Dangerous precedent. There it was, the proof, Knox hadn't just been an overzealous officer. He was a designed asset, a creature of policy and politics, crafted, rewarded, and preserved, not despite his actions, but because of them. As Zara probed deeper, forgotten names surfaced. A former State Academy commander who had handpicked Knox for Rapid Response Command. A federal inspector who signed off on nearly 50 of his arrests in half a year without reviewing a single complaint. A Homeland Security budget director who once called Knox a model of modern enforcement in a Grant report. They never swung batons or falsified reports, but they signed every dotted line. And now, they were pulling strings, using moderation tools and procedural delays to strangle her findings without ever appearing in public. Zara couldn't summon them. They weren't her subordinates. They didn't wear uniforms, but she knew. This was where real power lived. Knox had just been the expendable blade. They were the hand that held it. For weeks, she had believed she was investigating a M.A.N. officer who abused authority, a symbol of everything broken in their system. But the truth was harsher. Knox was a product, an output of a program coded long before she wore the badge, that a program with clean objectives on paper. Decrease crime, maximize efficiency, protect the city, but underneath those lines was an unspoken algorithm. Whoever delivers numbers stays. And Barry Knox delivered. During his peak years, from 2004 to 2006, Millstone collected nearly $11 million in federal aid for crime reduction in vulnerable zones. The East Side Initiative, Knox's territory, showed the steepest dip in recorded crime. No one asked how N01 tracked charges, and O1 followed up on drop cases or medical reports. The only thing that survived was the data. Data turned into charts. Charts became speeches. Speeches became promotions. Zara once sat across from an official at the State Security Grant Office, asking for help tracing misuse of funds tied to Knox's task force. The woman across the table had smiled gently. "Chief Quinn, I suggest you consider the broader picture. This isn't just about one man. This is how we pay for peace. If you want to keep this department alive, stop looking." It wasn't a threat, that IT was a fact. Knox was never supposed to be sacrificed, not unless someone could replace him. And the worst truth? Even after Zara had mapped out every crack in the wall, the system still didn't want it fixed. IT only wanted a cleaner cover. And someone new to carry the numbers forward. In a private meeting on the 12th floor of Millstone's Administrative Oversight Center, Zara Quinn sat in silence as a polished, suited official from the State Resource Allocation Board leaned forward and stated flatly, "If your department continues connecting Barry Knox to public-facing documents, regional stability funds will be withheld pending procedural review." He didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. It wasn't a request. It was a pressure valve being closed, slow, methodical, and mechanical. Zara didn't argue. She didn't nod. She simply stood and left without responding, her heels tapping once with finality on the marble floor. The moment the glass door hissed shut behind her, she felt it. She was no longer one of them. She had stepped outside the protective shell of institutional belonging and into the role of a public witness. A threat, not because she had broken the rules, but because she had dared to ask who had written them. Back at headquarters, Zara noticed a new kind of silence among her colleagues. It wasn't cold, it was careful. Officers who used to stop by her office to chat about weekend plans now walked the other way. Officials who once praised her leadership were suddenly unavailable for scheduled calls. National papers that had once dubbed her the face of reform now ran tepid editorials titled things like Zara Quinn's claims, courageous but premature. The narrative was shifting because someone behind the curtain was pulling it. Across town, Marlon James, now officially cleared of all charges, stepped out of the county facility not to cheers or cameras, but to his mother, standing at the gate with his old jacket and tired eyes. The fabric still smelled like the courthouse. She didn't speak. She just held it open, and he stepped into it, arms first, and then wrapped her in a long, still hug. Not out of drama, but because he finally understood this wasn't about him getting out. It was about her, about Zara, about what they had stepped into together. A system that only understood silence and submission. And they had given it neither. That night, Over a small pot of okra stew and cornbread, Zara spoke plainly. She told him everything, not as the chief, but as a woman who had peeled back a wall and seen rot so deep it had its own security clearance. Anonymous threats, whisper campaigns, official silence, private warnings from former mentors to pull back if she wanted to keep breathing professionally. She told them about the message scrawled across her birth certificate, about the meetings canceled last minute by the very agencies that once celebrated her rise. Marlon didn't say much at first. He stared at his plate like he was still holding onto some part of the cell. But then, softly, he spoke. I used to think I was the problem, that everything that happened to you was because of me, but it turns out I was the reason you didn't stop. Later that night, Marlon sat in his bedroom, alone except for the amber glow of a desk lamp. He opened his dusty laptop, wiped the screen with his sleeve, and opened the camera. No prep, no lighting tricks. Just him and the quiet resolve of a boy turned into a man before his time. My name is Marlon James, he said. Some of you remember me as a suspect. Some of you probably never knew me at all. But you know my sister. You saw what happened to her and what no one did about it. That courtroom didn't just fail her. It showed me something. It showed us all how far people will go to protect a lie. He didn't cry. He didn't curse. He just let the truth settle into the microphone like the last drop of rain before a flood. If a man who kicked the police chief can still sleep in his own bed, what exactly are we telling the next generation of cops? That there's no line too far? The video was raw, unfiltered, 7 minutes, no edits. It went viral not because of production, but because every syllable cut through the fog of polished excuses. The views surged past 100,000 before the sun rose. Not through press channels, but through personal messages, student group chats, neighborhood circles, mothers who had once written complaints and never heard back. Zara didn't know about the video until someone forwarded her a clip with a message. Your brother just lit a match under this whole city. By midday, community leaders, school teachers, youth pastors, and even a union of retired military veterans had issued statements. One read, when a boy gets arrested for doing the right thing, and the officer who assaulted his sister keeps his pension, the system has failed. Not in theory, but in practice. The following morning, the district attorney issued a public order. Officer Barry Knox was to be taken into custody immediately, pending investigation for multiple offenses, including use of force on a protected official and obstruction of justice. The language was clear. No allegedly. No still under review. Just 3 words that rang across every news ticker. Knox. In. Custodied. In. Oh, flashy arrest. No lights and sirens. Just 2 plainclothes agents knocking on his suburban door. Neighbors peeked out, but no one came close. Knox stepped out in a sagging hoodie and sweatpants, unshaven, hair matted at the crown. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The lenses were no longer from across the parking lot. They were level with his face. Watching him enter the system he once shaped from the inside, he was escorted not to a press podium, but to interrogation room 2. The same room he had once ruled like a stage director. Same room, same angle, same table. Only this time, he sat without his badge, without his notepad, without backup. Just his own hands trembling softly on the table's edge. The question was simple. Why didn't you file a report on what happened that day in court? Knox blinked. He looked at the wall as if the mirror would rescue him. It didn't. There was no script to follow. No cleanup crew to polish the narrative. Just a man aging by the minute in a uniform he never imagined wearing. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out, but he glanced at the one-way mirror again. And for the first time, that mirror didn't reflect power. It reflected fear. Not from the public. From him. Because now he was finally visible. Not as the symbol of order, but as the symptom of a sickness that could no longer be denied. Zara Quinn had not overthrown the system, but she had exposed its spine. And now the people who once held it upright were scrambling, not to protect justice, but to explain how they had let it slip through their fingers for so long that an fist slammed down. No voices rose, but the silence inside that questioning chamber hung like concrete, heavier than any gavel strike. Barry Knox, once the man who used silence as a tool, to unsettle, to intimidate, to dominate, now sat caged by it. The same quiet that once made others squirm now chipped away at him, second by second. When he finally did speak, his voice cracked somewhere between excuse and realization. I, I didn't think it was that serious. 7 words. That was all. But they didn't fall gently. They clattered into the case file, stamped, transcribed, recorded. Evidence not of guilt, but of vulnerability. And in this system, vulnerability was the beginning of collapse. Because the moment he admitted misjudging severity, the entire machine he once represented was forced to face a truth it never tolerated. Barry Knox could be wrong. And if he was wrong once, who's to say he hadn't always been? The interrogators didn't need to argue. The room didn't need fireworks. What mattered was already unfolding. Knox, the figure once beyond reproach, couldn't summon a single useful sentence. No buck-up, no policy jargon, just a man reaching the end of a script that had always protected him. Until now. By the 3rd day, the collapse had moved from subtle to visible. Knox looked worn, sweat dampening his neckline. His gray correctional issue shirt bunched awkwardly at the shoulders, creased from restless nights. Scratches lined his right wrist, a small tell from where he'd pressed and repressed his hand against the table, desperate for steadiness that refused to come. His gaze rarely rose. His voice came in hesitant fragments. His answers were delayed, like he was waiting for someone else to speak first. But no one did in a call from the State Oversight Division. No legal representative whispering strategy through a crack in the door. And then, the first real rupture. His lawyer filed a formal withdrawal. The wording was bureaucratic dry. Client has failed to maintain transparency in representation. But everyone in the inner circle knew what it meant. His own legal shield no longer trusted him. Knox didn't protest, but his jaw stiffened, and his fingers curled slowly inward, not in anger, but like a man trying to hold on to the last edge of a cliff. The unraveling accelerated. Former allies retracted their names. One commander who once toasted Knox as the backbone of zone enforcement declined to testify. A city policy analyst who had previously called him a reform-minded guardian of the field resigned, citing stress. Even a state homeland executive, once photographed shaking his hand at a legislative ceremony, released a statement containing just 3 words, "No public position." But it wasn't what they said that sealed his fate. It was what they erased. Archived emails that once praised Knox's field decisions vanished from internal drives. Official timelines were subtly altered. One old incident report had its date moved back 3 months, just enough to distance it from a key scandal. A direct quote from a 2019 law enforcement summit. Knox represents the gold standard. Was scrubbed from all digital materials. N01 shouted for his guilt. But no one defended his innocence either. Because in a system built on performance, protection ends the moment usefulness fades. And Knox? He was no longer useful. Not to the department. Not to the system. Not even to the men who once molded him. He had become radioactive, untouched, unclaimed, quietly deleted. That afternoon, the intake gate of Eastgate Civil Holding Facility groaned open. But this time, the man stepping through wore no shield, no sidearm, no prestige. He walked in with cuffed hands and sagging shoulders, his head down, guided by 2 junior officers who didn't speak his name. No honorifics, no nods of respect, just chain of custody. One of the guards behind the desk looked up, blinked, and gave the smallest pause before typing his name into the log. No salute, just another file. Knox had become a liability wrapped in old medals. Down the corridor of Unit Delta, he passed doors that echoed with the faint sounds of routine, scraping chairs, clinking utensils, quiet muttering. But every face that glanced at him turned away just as quickly. They all knew who he was. Not the myth. The M.A.N.A.T. the final turn. A weather corrections officer. A gray-haired man who had once processed Knox's complaints against problem inmates, caught sight of him, and turned around. Silent rejection. No words needed. Then came the door. Cell 2B. He didn't need a guide, that he'd once ordered men into it himself. That IT was a basic cell. Stainless steel toilet in the corner, one thin mattress bolted to iron slats, a camera he'd personally approved years ago mounted in the ceiling. He'd claimed it was for safety. Now it felt like exposure. In that very room, years ago, he'd had a boy locked up, barely 17, arrested for mouthing off after being mistaken for a suspect. The kid had yelled, yes. He had cursed, but he hadn't resisted. Knox had labeled him aggressive anyway, and the report had held. Now Knox sat where the boy had once sat. On that same bed, the echo of footsteps faded. The door clicked shut behind him, and oh bars. No spotlights, just a man, alone in a room designed to strip away certainty and oh special treatment. No loyalists outside waiting with talking points. Just a memory creeping up the walls, whispering, this is what power looks like when it's finished. The red imprint of the cuffs still circled Barry Knox's wrists, raw and faintly swelling. Sweat clung to the back of his neck, beating under the collar of his intake shirt. The air wasn't tighter than usual. The space wasn't colder, but it felt wrong. Not because of where he was, but because of what he wasn't anymore, that he couldn't issue commands. Couldn't raise his voice and watch a room fall silent. Couldn't call for backup. No status, no badge, just a number, handwritten in marker on a cheap paper tag, pinned to his chest like an afterthought. His name wasn't mentioned once during processing. The man once referred to as Commander Knox now answered to D. 48612. His first meal arrived on a gray plastic tray, stale white bread, cold beans, and lukewarm water in a cracked cup. He accepted it without a word, stepped toward the metal bench along the wall, and waited. Waited. For the first time in his life, he had to stand in line. No one shoved him, no one stared too long, but no one moved to make room either. That he got the message. Fear had left the room. And for the first time in Barry's career, hell, his entire life, there was no door he could open from his side. That night passed without a whisper of violence. No shouts from the upper tiers. No mess hall brawls. But sleep never came. The light overhead buzzed relentlessly. His cot was hard, uneven, but it wasn't discomfort that kept him awake. It was the eyes watching from across the corridor. Silent, still, and sharp. Not the kind of fear he used to elicit with a glance or a threat. This was colder. Disgust. Vindication. Faces that had once dropped when he entered a room now stared directly back. Barry turned to face the wall, but the weight of their gaze stayed. The next morning, assigned to floor duty as a new intake, he moved down the cell block, pushing a mop bucket. He passed one row of cells with a slow drag, keeping his eyes forward. Then came the voice, rough, gravel-scraped low. I remember your elbow. 88 King Street. You slammed my head against a fence. Barry paused for a half-beat. Didn't look, didn't nod, but he remembered the street. He didn't recall the man. Why would he? He'd never cared to. But that voice remembered him. There were no files, no camera stills, no official records to name. But inside those walls, memory was king. And the memories of Barry Knox were carved deep. Into bones, into bruises, into silence. They remembered the zip ties, the slaps under cover of transport, the forms marked non-compliant, the nights someone screamed in the holding cell. And he said it was protocol. Now, no one screamed. No one laid a hand on him. But no one shielded him either. The guards treated him as a special case detainee, but not out of respect. It was damage control. If anything happened to Knox, the whole facility would be under state audit. So the safest option was isolation. Controlled silence. Preventative disconnection. He ate alone, cleaned alone, breathed in a space of shadowed resentment. The other inmates didn't threaten him. They just looked and kept looking. To a young man, barely 20, leaned over to his bunkmate as Barry passed by. Yo, that's him? Thought he'd be taller. Shakes like the rest of him. It wasn't a threat. It was worse, dismissal. The aura he'd built, the illusion of invincibility, it only lived when fear did. And when that fear disappeared, everything else crumbled. The polished shoes, the morning briefings, the command center nods. They had all existed because others were too afraid to say no. Now there was no more room for fear. Only observation, not bowed heads, but level eyes. And they all said the same thing. Your turn. Most people assumed the story ended with Knox in a cell, that the system had corrected itself. But Zara Quinn knew better. Point one fall didn't collapse a tower. She began at the base, where every buried story started. The civil complaints marked dismissed, unfounded, or the bureaucratic favorite. Insufficient cause to investigate. Zara didn't trust the department's filtering process. She made a direct request to the Millstone Records Bureau. Every civilian complaint filed over the past 15 years, particularly those involving use of force, wrongful arrest, or procedural violations. What came back was staggering. Point one, 241 cases, most handwritten. Many barely filled beyond a paragraph. Most had never been seen beyond a precinct clerk's desk. The patterns were immediate. Minors, undocumented workers, homeless citizens, women in public housing, all either ignored or stamped as non-cooperative. These weren't outliers. They were symptoms. Zara didn't route the files through internal affairs. She formed her own unit, unofficial, independent, civilian-led, a former defense attorney from the North Circuit, a university analyst who studied race-based policy deviation, a man who once led a neighborhood watch but got arrested by the officer he called for help, and most notably, Cole Rivas, whose front teeth had been shattered during a stop and frisk. He'd signed a charge sheet with bloody fingers. Zara didn't call him to apologize. She handed him his file. "You don't need closure," she said. "You need the truth they wrote when they thought no one would read it." They called themselves Root Review, not reform, not reconciliation, no flowery slogans, just the truth. Each case was mapped, cross-referenced by district, officer, supervising command, and ultimate outcome. They built a live access tracking board where complainants could log in and see the status of their case. Who was reviewing it? What stage it was at? And why? The first reopened case, a black mechanic arrested for vehicle theft intent while asleep in his own car after a double shift. Zara asked the data compliance lead, "Why wasn't this reviewed?" The answer was blunt. No camera footage. Officer had a strong performance record. They passed it over. There it was, the quiet, corrosive rule of the system. Trust the numbers, not the people. If an officer had the stats, the complaints didn't matter. And now Zara's team was lifting each of those numbers apart, one complaint at a time. Not to rebrand the department, not to fix its image, but to show that for years, the system had been run on a currency no one had ever audited: suspicion without proof. A complaint with no footage. A high-output officer in the system's good graces. That was all it used to take to bury a file. But under Zara Quinn's leadership, that formula collapsed. She began by reconstructing the data map. Not the one used by precinct analysts, but one made for public view. A digital heat grid that tracked areas with the most complaint dismissals over a 10-year period. Red zones glowed across neighborhoods with consistent racial disparities. A footnote encouraged: if your complaint was ignored, you may now request an official review. No legal counsel required. Within 2 weeks, 236 responses came in. Some names matched old records tied to Barry Knox. But Zara wasn't interested in creating a hit list. She set a new rule. Don't just ask who violated protocol. Ask who allowed it, who endorsed it, who looked away. The goal wasn't vengeance. It was insulation. Insulating the next generation from the same cycle. An press blitz followed. No podium. Only a quiet update posted to Millstone's official portal. If your voice was once ignored, it won't be this time that we are obligated to answer. For the first time in years, justice no longer wore a uniform. IT didn't hide behind acronyms or wield laminated badges. That IT answered to people who once believed silence was their only protection. And Zara made sure that door stayed open. Her idea of justice didn't center on punishment. It focused on prevention, building a structure so clear that hiding behind policies became impossible. That meant tracing behavior back to the machinery that rewarded it. She requested archived evaluation reports from 2007 onward, but not the kind shown at promotion ceremonies, the internal ones. Specifically, she cross-referenced positive performance reviews with dismissed complaints. The results were stark. Dozens of officers had climbed ranks because they hit high arrest numbers in troubled zones. Zones with known abuse patterns. In one case, an officer was cited for stabilizing a high-risk neighborhood. But in that same block, 15 complaints have been dismissed within 1 year. Every complainant either lacked formal documentation or had no legal rep. Zara didn't leak the names to journalists. She sent the files directly to Millstone's Independent Review Council, a group with teeth comprised of citizens, legal scholars, and civil rights observers. They were asked 3 questions per file. Who signed off on this promotion? Who ruled the complaint invalid? Was there a shared benefit, monetary, political, or departmental? These were once the questions no one asked out loud. Now they were pinned to the Public Accountability Board, right next to city crime statistics. If a connection was found, Zara gave a simple order. Mark the file in red. Not for shame, but so every future recruit entering the force could see the path not to repeat. N01 was fired immediately and no purges. No performative takedowns. Zara didn't need a spectacle. She needed a culture shift. She began building what she called Witness Echo, a civilian feedback network embedded directly into post-encounter reporting. Citizens received encrypted codes allowing them to submit reviews of any police interaction. Comments were parsed by pattern tracking AI. Officers receiving 3 or more negative entries in a 6-month period without offsetting commendations triggered an internal flag. But the key reform was what followed. The officer was required to respond in writing to the citizen, not a form letter, not through legalese, their own words. Their own name that IT wasn't enough to believe they were justified. Now they had to explain it. If they were wrong, no shield of protocol. No excuse of just following orders. They had to face the person they failed. In parallel, Zara launched the Clearview portal, a public dashboard updated monthly with anonymized civilian feedback, case outcomes, and behavior trends. No department edits. No bureaucratic filters. Researchers, journalists, even students could download the raw data. One undergrad from Millstone Polytechnic wrote Zara a letter. Your data allowed me to finish my capstone on accountability models. But more than that, it made me feel like my city finally sees us. That wasn't the goal, but it proved the point. When justice is visible, it grows in directions power never predicts. Zara never attached her name to the system. Review from Root had no director's headshot, an O slogan. No department logo, just one rule, etched into the internal charter. Every file once closed is a doorway that we don't measure justice by silence, that we measure it by how many doors we open. Millstone used to be a name muttered with unease and asterisk next to any discussion of law reform. Not because it was the worst, but because it was the most normalized. Wrongful arrests were shrugged off. Complaints went unread. Courtroom violence wasn't headline-worthy. IT was routine. When Barry Knox kicked a woman, Zara, in court, locals didn't react with shock. They reacted with exhaustion. Because they'd lived through invisible kicks for decades. Kicks made of denials, missing reports, muted footage, whispered threats, and routine processing. But then something different happened. Millstone didn't bury IT. IT didn't sweep the scandal or spin it in a patriotic defense. Instead, it faced a mirror, not with speeches, with systems, and not to restore trust, but to earn it. That Zara's Root Review Network did more than reopen old wounds. That IT made the system bleed truth from the origin. For every case reopened, the protocol now included a timestamp trail, a reviewer history log, and a public-facing accountability matrix that if something went wrong, the public could see it, from the original officer to the supervisor to the clerk who checked the wrong box. Even closed cases from over a decade ago were given a second life. Not for closure, but for clarity. Today, Millstone isn't known as Knox's city, that it's the first city in the state with live access to officer behavioral data, real-time civilian feedback systems, and oversight meetings where a seat is always left open for a community voice, not a voice without a badge. Not on any payroll, but with veto power if transparency is compromised. Because in Zara Quinn's Millstone, justice isn't the absence of wrongdoing, it's the presence of people willing to look deeper. Even when silence is more comfortable. In Millstone, civilian complaints no longer had to pass through the filter of human resources before being considered credible. There was no screening for validity or tone. Even something as minor as a glare from an officer previously brushed off as subjective, was now recorded and flagged as potential behavioral drift. IT wasn't just paperwork anymore, that IT was data with weight. What changed Millstone wasn't the software or surveillance upgrades, that IT was something harder to engineer, accountability without denial. When a list surfaced of 47 dismissed complaints directly tied to Barry Knox's time in charge, the city didn't hide behind phrases like internal oversight or reevaluation pending. Instead, the statement on the public platform was blunt: we failed. We are reviewing every case, one by one. That single line shifted the city's story. Media outlets that once labeled Millstone a command-and-control dead zone began using phrases like a city brave enough to investigate itself. In courtroom panels and university debates, legal students pointed to Millstone not as a hero story, but as a proof of concept. You don't change the system by swapping faces. You change it by redesigning the questions it answers. Zara didn't stand at podiums. She didn't sign reform bills in front of cameras. She stayed behind the curtain and let the victims speak. Former complainants became advisors. Independent panels, not departments, held the briefings. There were no mascots, no slogans, no posters lining street poles. Just one discreet inscription stitched into the city's updated seal. We are not the example. We are the evidence that healing is possible. That's what made people listen, not the speeches, not the funding, but the humility to AT first. No one expected a mid-sized city like Millstone to have a national ripple effect. IT didn't have a powerful mayor or a celebrity endorser. There are no viral videos, no congressional testimonies, but what it did have was clarity. Clear numbers, clear actions, clear ethics. That's why, just 3 months into the post-Mitchell transformation, cities started calling. Seattle requested Millstone's public behavior feedback template. Sacramento invoked Millstone's name in 14 different motions during a judiciary emergency session, not as a cautionary tale, but as an attainable benchmark. The reform wasn't just about reopening cases. IT redefined how every case was explained in more cold bureaucratic responses like, review did not yield sufficient procedural concern. Instead, a new standard. If we made a mistake, we'll tell you how. And more importantly, we'll say your name, the name the system once chose to forget. In Chicago, at a national reform summit, an entire panel was dedicated to the Millstone transition. Zara wasn't there. She had declined the invite. But her team made sure every reform framework, tool, and record protocol was published online, freely downloadable by anyone. That a legal mediator from Detroit summed it up best. We don't need a myth. We need a city that proves this doesn't have to collapse under scrutiny. Millstone proved it. Civil rights organizations in Pittsburgh, Atlanta, and New Orleans ran parallel audits using Millstone's behavioral flagging algorithms. What they found stunned them. Up to 1 in 5 past arrests in their cities would require reinvestigation if the same transparent system was applied. That wasn't just a pattern. IT was proof at a quiet indictment of selective blindness baked into enforcement culture. And the most astonishing part? Millstone didn't ask to be recognized. There were no campaigns shouting Millstone made the model. Yet across online forums, legal blogs, human rights panels, and academic white papers, Millstone's name started showing up. That a whisper, a watermark, at a new compass. That a grassroots legal nonprofit in Houston put it this way: you don't have to copy Millstone. But if your city hasn't done at least what Millstone has, then you're still part of the harm. And that was the real shift. The reform wasn't a checklist. That IT was a cultural lens. What spread wasn't the system. That IT was the belief underneath it. That justice doesn't begin with a courtroom verdict. IT begins with the courage to say, we got it wrong. While other cities focused on repairing their image, Millstone focused on keeping the cracks visible. Because when you leave the errors on display, every step forward actually means something. That's not the kind of truth you need to advertise. That IT walks in, quietly sits down at the table, and says, let's start where everyone else pretended nothing happened. After the Independent Oversight Committee released its final findings, Zara Quinn's inbox flooded. Offers came from every direction. News anchors wanting exclusive interviews, reform summits asking her to headline, legal journals requesting essays, even a personal letter from the state governor urging her to accept the Civilian Integrity Medal. One journalist's voicemail put it plainly. You're the kind of leader this country needs to see. Zara didn't respond with anger. She didn't argue. She gave the same calm reply she'd offered every time before. This wasn't for applause. She never wanted her name trending. Never wanted her face plastered on courthouse murals, captioned "The Woman Who Saved Millstone." To Zara, this wasn't a win. It was a correction long overdue. When a system stays silent long enough, breaking that silence isn't bravery. It's responsibility. And responsibility doesn't need a headline. A documentary crew once sent her a mock trailer. It showed her standing alone beneath the courthouse arch, backlit like a film hero. A dramatic voiceover said, "The woman who stood against the system." Zara replied to the email with one line, "I didn't stand alone, and I didn't want to fight." This was never about attention. She didn't want to become a symbol polished and paraded by the very institutions that had once ignored every plea she tried to elevate. She didn't do it to be loved. She did it because no one else was doing it. She still clocked in on time each morning. She sat through working lunches with her civil review team, responded to every case appeal late at night under the same flickering light above her desk, and red carpets and panels. Just more reports, more lives. The public spoke her name now, on message boards and advocacy groups at kitchen tables, but Zara stayed in the background. Not out of modesty, out of conviction. This was never about her voice. That IT was about giving everyone else theirs. Justice, to her, wasn't a badge or a moment. It was the kind of daily work that's only noticed when it stops being done. When the Millstone City Council convened a closed session one Monday morning to vote on a new city flag, it was framed as the beginning of a new chapter. Three options were brought in for review. A stylized lantern of justice. A unified circle meant to symbolize law and community. A gavel raised against a blue backdrop. All three designs were sent to Zara's office with a respectful request. As the lead figure of reform, your final input would be an honor. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she printed out each mock-up, spread them across her desk, studied them quietly, and then tucked them into a drawer. Later that day, she sent back a handwritten message. Let the flag have no emblem, no words, just a plain field, gray and white, like the case folders whose ink has faded. The council was stunned. One member whispered aloud, "But without a symbol, how will anyone remember?" That question was the problem. They were still looking for something safe to point to, something marketable, something to paste on buildings and banners. Zara's answer wasn't about branding. It was about memory. Real, uncomfortable memory. To her, no symbol could ever cleanse what had been ignored, and no shape or color could undo what had been allowed to persist. Not until people were forced to sit with the silence itself. The absence had to speak to, no one could pretend it was solved. And when the council agreed to her proposal, the flag was raised on a fog-chilled morning. November 2 ND, an parade, and dignitaries. Just a clerk in an old jacket pulling the line slowly as a square of gray-white cloth caught the wind outside City Hall, and one clapped. But no one asked why it was blank, because by now they understood that Zara wasn't there. She was at her desk, reviewing citizen feedback on a misconduct case from 2012. A young assistant ran in, holding up a phone, showing her the live stream. She looked, nodded, then turned back to her report, not out of indifference, but because some victories don't require applause, some stories don't need a spotlight. Sometimes, the right thing is to step out of the frame and let the people see what's left when the noise dies down. Millstone didn't need another hero. IT needed to rebuild its floorboards so that every person, uniform or not, titled or untitled, could trust that if they fell, someone would see them and call them by name. Interrogation room 4 hadn't changed. Gray walls, exposed wiring. One metal table, 2 chairs, and the one-way mirror Zara had fought to make recordable. Barry Knox had sat here many times before, but always on the other side. The side with the clipboard, the badge, the posture that could make anyone stutter just by leaning in. Now he sat with nothing in front of him but an case file and insignia. Just a cup of water, a damp brow, and trembling hands pressed flat to the table like he was trying to brace against the weight of being truly seen. Officer entered N01 sat opposite, but behind the glass, someone was watching that he didn't sense it, he knew it. Then came a voice, even, direct, no edge, no theater. You have no title now, no uniform. So, who are you really? He flinched, he knew that voice, didn't need it introduced. Zara, the woman he'd once kicked to the floor in open court, the one he dismissed with a smirk and silence. Now she was the voice asking the question he had never prepared for. He looked toward the glass, saw no one but only himself. Older, smaller, eyes that couldn't look away anymore, that he answered. Not like a man making a statement, but like someone shedding the last illusion he had. I thought, if I hit fast and spoke loud, they'd call me the one who kept things in line. A long pause. All I ever did was teach people to be afraid. No reply came. No scribbling. No accusations. Just stillness. And in that silence, for the first time in 2 decades, he didn't try to win the room. He just sat in it. Not sorry in the way that asks for forgiveness, but exposed in a way that can't be hidden anymore. And the mirror, cold, silent, blank, reflected back the one thing no sentence could replace, that a man who had once held all the power. Now staring at the only judge who couldn't be swayed. Himself, he had gone too far. Not because the world failed to stop him, but because he never paused long enough to ask who he was becoming. Zara's question still echoed in his mind, not as an accusation, but as a wound slowly turning into awareness. You have no authority now. No uniform. Oh, who are you really? Barry Knox didn't have an answer. Not yet. But maybe for the first time, he had found where to begin. Not with paperwork. Not with the procedures he'd once enforced. Not with the rank that used to shield him like armor, but with the hollow that now lived where his reputation used to be. The room remained still after his confession. I never learned how to make people feel safe. No follow-up questions. No checklist. No comment from behind the mirror. Just stillness, shared between two people who had once stood on opposite ends of power. And now, in a way neither planned, they stood eye to eye. Point one behind the glass, one in front of it. Finally, his voice broke the silence again, softer than anyone had ever heard from him. Not the man with the booming orders or courtroom presence, just the man behind a shell. Were you ever afraid, choosing all this? No mockery and bravado. Just an honest question from someone who had once believed fear only existed on the streets and in the cells. That Zara's voice came back calm. Not triumphant, not heavy, just steady. I was afraid of being called reckless, afraid of getting it wrong. But what scared me more than anything was becoming quiet, just like you once hoped people like me would be. She didn't need to add more. The point wasn't to corner him with guilt. The moment was not about defeating him. It was about revealing him. To himself, he gave a small nod, not of agreement, but of understanding, then reached down and brushed his fingers across the faded marks circling his wrists. Not ashamed, not proud, just acknowledging. When he looked up again, it wasn't with the fire of someone seeking redemption. It was a quieter thing, a raw and cautious reach toward what might be left. Do you think someone like me could start over somewhere? The words were careful, not begging, not calculated, but a man imagining, maybe for the first time, a life not built on being obeyed. Zara didn't enter the room. She didn't sit across from him. But her voice carried in again, deliberate, unflinching, and free of judgment. I don't know where you'll begin, but no one's born wearing a badge, and no one should be trapped forever in the worst thing they did, if they're brave enough to call it what it was. Knox closed his eyes. That a single drop slid down the side of his face. Whether sweat or something else, he didn't brush it away. He just let it be. The way things should have been long ago, seen, not denied. He remained in the chair a few moments longer, alone, not guarded. The silence in the room was different now. Not cold, not tense, just honest. He was no longer Officer Knox, and no longer the shield behind procedure. He was simply Barry, a man who had lived too long by control, now finally sitting still with consequence. Zara left the monitoring room in silence. An O1 greeted her in the hallway. An O press statement followed. Knox was escorted back to his unit. No cuffs this time, but no farewell either. An O redemption arc. No curtain call. just steps echoing down a corridor. He used a command that their story didn't end in an embrace or public apology that IT didn't need to. What remained was a quiet question, not for headlines, not for legacy. If there's no badge, no rank, no authority, then who are we really? That question trailed behind both of them. For Zara, it became a reminder to never lead from fear. For Barry, it became a place to start again, not by rewriting what happened, but by living truthfully in its shadow. Justice, they both understood now, wasn't the hammer or the verdict. IT was the mirror, and only those willing to stand before it, naked, unarmed, unranked, would ever find the freedom they claimed to defend.